Hello everybody, back again. Now I hope there's some banging going on outside. Hopefully that won't get picked up. And I just wanted to share, as the title said, I believe my rage is my superpower. And I think I've realised that for a long time now. It truly was. And at one time, I felt deep shame. I wanted to hide it and put it in the dungeon, thought it was something dangerous and ugly and very unprofessional. And, growing up, you're taught very strongly that anger is not allowed, let alone rage. It didn't start off as rage. I think it began very early on as anger, as a sense of helplessness, complete impotency. And I think as a child, you're a victim and very vulnerable in the environments that you're in. And of course, growing up in the UK by very conservative, somewhat parents, to grow up to believe that, emotions are not appropriate, not allowed, shouldn't be expressed. And really, you grow up those first 7 years, parents telling you to stop shouting, stop being angry, be kind, share your things, don't feel, just don't feel, because you're being taught by, parents that were also taught not to feel. So I'm just going to turn this. And so I realised my anger was very much suppressed, repressed, depressed, call it what you like. And as I got a bit older, obviously, and grew up, it turned into rage. It turned into rage, which was, and as you get older, you're able to express it more because, you're an older person. And it didn't happen very often. I think the worst time was when I was under a lot of stress as a parent, early married as a young parent. The stress was so difficult. I think having children triggered a lot of unprocessed wounds. And so I always saw my rage as something to be ashamed of, ugly, just not appropriate at all. And I didn't really understand my rage. I never really understood why am I so angry. I knew I was angry. I always have been. I've always had issues with anger. And every now and again it would pop out. And it was quite an interesting journey for me because I was angry with people and people didn't want to know about that. People, no, don't be angry. Just don't be angry. No one sort of told you how to process anger, what to do with anger, how to lean into anger, how to be curious about anger. No one did that, and obviously as I grew up and I matured and I started working with people, it became my life goal to figure out how to help people manage their emotions. Well, of course, you help other people, you help yourself. And so I realized that, the capacity I can really feel my rage was and realized it was just one of my greatest superpowers. And so that journey's taken me a long time, and I probably haven't really had rage. I might be, and I think I've processed a lot of my rage, and so I don't ever feel very ragey, but I have the capacity to still feel rage. And I realize the capacity to feel any emotion is the capacity to feel any emotion, because we call them good, bad, and ugly, don't we? But really, emotion is emotion. Because I want to feel the capacity of joy and peace and tranquility and excitement, and I want to feel them to the depth of my being. Well, you can't do one without the other. And so for me, it was about learning to process some of the old resentments, and stop repressing the anger, and starting to realize that anger is kind of a wonderful gift. It's God-given. Because it doesn't destroy. You see, I think we think it does. We think rage destroys. Rage is just an expression, because if you allow rage to speak to you, it reveals something. It reveals that it's trying to protect you from something, and ultimately it can be transformed and transform you. And so it took me a while to get that and understand that, because rage is the epitome of what you can feel. But I mean, anyone that's loved anyone realizes that their depth for feeling sad is immense. Why should it be any different with anger or rage? And in fact, I always knew my rage was healthier in some way, because it was revealing something to me, the reason we feel angry is usually because someone's taken advantage of us. There's something unfair happening. You're being walked over. You're being abused. I mean, usually you don't get angry for no apparent reason. Anger is a God-given emotion that we feel when we feel any of those things happening. And so what's wrong with anger? But if you're taught in a community, civilization, a tribe, gang, group, family, that no, anger's wrong, but then you see someone visibly being angry, what does that do to a child? It messes them up. So for me, it was about understanding my own personal story of where my rage came from. And of course, it comes from every moment where you felt you didn't have a voice, you didn't get heard, you didn't get seen, you weren't allowed to be autonomous, even to the point of dressing yourself, making a decision about what you didn't want to eat. And a lot of these things were done for us. I think, when I was growing up back in the 60s and 70s, you did as you were told. You didn't have a voice, you weren't important, no one really asked you anything. I'll tell you what to think and I'll tell you what to feel. I mean, that was just socialization. That was just the way, kids were brought up back in the day. And we realize now when we look back, a lot of that is very destructive to a human's capacity to feel good about themselves. And so I'm not blaming anyone here. We all do what, and I did the same thing, to a certain degree. Obviously I learned differently, so I did things differently, and I'm not, and every generation does hopefully a little bit better than the last. So I'm not playing any blame game, because I don't think there's any point to that. I'm just talking about how it is and how I developed those roots of rage, which came from not having a voice, not feeling heard, feeling controlled, feeling suffocated, feeling perhaps even violated on some level because your autonomy isn't allowed to exist. It's like, no, you do as you're told. You wear this, you say this, you don't say that. Okay, so there was a time that obviously it wasn't safe for me to feel my anger. So what did I do? I had to swallow it, repress it, deny it, smile through it, try to be a good little girl, the kind one, the good one. And because if I wasn't, maybe I wouldn't have been loved, and I'd have been abandoned and rejected, and so I couldn't afford to do that. So I have to be the good little girl and repress all that anger, because if I'd have got angry, what would have happened? I'd have got into more trouble. So I realised you push all that, push it down, and the anger, rage, fire goes deeper, and it kind of builds up. And it actually takes a lot of capacity to hold all that down. And if you get stressed or vulnerable or, going through a lot, it's much more easy to kind of shoot out with a lot of energy behind it because you've repressed it. And so therefore it comes out and feels out of control. And this is why a lot of people think rage is a bad thing, because people who feel rage often will act out of control and then do something. And I spoke to many of people that have been beaten, abused by someone who's in red rage, or that place of rage where they're just so they're so reactive and they just can't even pull back. They can't temper their actions. They just, and a lot of it is because it's been, and it's like a bomb waiting to go off. And if you're in the room when it goes off, God help you. And I've sat with people like that, and I've been that person. So. And most of the time I would be able to, repress it, but then there were moments where I couldn't, and that's when it came out. And I realised if I kept seeing it as a very negative thing, as a bad thing, as an ugly thing, something to be ashamed of, all I did was repress it again, once again. Oh, look, there's me being a bad person, there's me being out of control. And really, that rage didn't need to be repressed. It needed to be understood, it needed to be held, it needed some time. It needed me to understand it and listen to it and hear it and see it and spend time with it. And once I understood that, it took the sting out of it. It wasn't so bad and ugly anymore. It was just part of me that I had to learn to come through for, nurture, engage with, embrace, etc., etc. Because this causes a lot of fatigue, numbness. You know, we kind of push it so far, we put it into the deep freeze and then disconnect from it, and it just feels like nothing. It becomes numb, and it just builds resentments. And so, obviously, I had to allow it to be there. I had to acknowledge that, okay, I didn't like it, I didn't want it, but it was part of me. Just like you would if you had a bad leg or a sore leg. Maybe you had a manky leg or a funny finger and you didn't hated it, but you couldn't just reject it, get rid of it, pull it off and throw it away. You had to kind of learn to work with it, live with it, come through for it, embrace it, learn to look after it. And it's exactly the same with emotions that we don't like to feel. So I learned to have a voice around it. What was the anger really all about? What was the resentment really all about? Well, there was a little girl in there that was pissed off with not being heard, understood, listened to, given the attention to. And of course, you know, I'm grown up now, so it's no longer the parents' job to do that. I didn't realise, but it was my job to do that, because I would put that part of me in front of someone and then beat them up for not giving that part of me what I needed. And really it wasn't. I was going to continue to do that. It wasn't their job. It was my job to listen, allow, engage with it, nurture it, listen to it, validate it, not buy into it. If you get all caught up into it, you just end up in a little pity party, don't you? Or poor me, poor me. And it's not about doing that. That's sympathy. I had to be empathic, but not sympathetic. It's like, poor me, that's what sympathy is. It's like, oh, poor you. And sympathy just feels sorry for people, and I don't think that works. No one wants to be pitied. I just needed it to be acknowledged, to be validated, to be expressed, to be allowed to exist, to give it a voice and listen and validate. And so, you know, I think when you get to the point of rage, though, it's like your body says, no more, I can't take any more, I can't take any more. And it expresses it, and it looks a little bit out of control. So it's the part, I've written a few notes here, that's all. It's the part that rises when something I love is being hurt, namely me, or it could be me, it could be someone else, or something I care about. I mean, I would get angry about seeing injustice in the world. You know, it would make me really angry. Something I have no control over, something I can't really do anything about. Kids getting killed in certain parts of the country. And I realise this is what the news does. This is what some of the stuff you watch. It evokes a lot of emotion. Well, what's the point? You know, you're just getting angry. Why? Because something injustice is happening over here. And I realised the more I had unresolved issues inside of me, the more I'd get triggered by the things outside that I couldn't do anything about. And I think there's no power in that. That's just, you know, this is why phones get called the weapon of mass distraction, because they're trying to evoke a lot of negative emotions. Look what's happening here, look what's happening there. It's like it's so unfair, it's so unjust, and then we get all angry and upset. And really, a lot of these things, some things we have some power over and control, but most of it we don't. And so it's about learning to listen to what's being impacted inside of you. And so if you've got unresolved pain, anger, that's created a lot of rage, then that's going to be projected out onto the things that you see outside of you in the world. And so I think rage really helped me understand where I began and ended, you know, to own how I was feeling, to connect me to my truth, even though I perhaps didn't want to. I didn't want to kind of really be honest about stuff. I didn't want to express how that hurt me, or I felt scared and alone and vulnerable, because it's vulnerable to feel those things. And when you haven't been in a safe space where you felt safe to have emotions, then those, when they arise, it feels very shameful and very uncomfortable that we want to reject, deny, avoid and repress it all again. And so I had to learn to make space, make room, open up, allow, listen, even if I didn't like what I heard. So it did connect me to my truth, but that wasn't always easy. It cracked open places where I had long stopped feeling, and I think that's the thing with rage. It can do that. It's like deep grief. If someone dies, the pain will sometimes crack us open, and for me it wasn't the grief or the pain, it was the anger and the rage that cracked me open, because I just couldn't live like that. I just couldn't keep living like this, like I was at the mercy of this rage, because it felt big and overwhelming and like it was going to destroy me from the inside out. So it's about learning to realize that I can express it, process it, allow it, acknowledge it, have some empathy for it, realize where it came from, realize how it was still playing out. So I didn't try to repress it, and I didn't let it sort of hijack me into behaviors that I didn't want to be behaving in, like shouting, screaming, lashing out. I gave it a voice. I think it's so important to give it a voice, and I think it's so hard for us to find a safe space to have a voice, but I had to find that within me, allowed to breathe. And when I went for therapy, I had to write it down. I had to write down my feelings of anger and rage, and I wrote them to certain individuals and was able to get it out of here onto here, and then so from here to here. You write it, you read it, you express it, you process it, you heal from it. And that was so healing for me. But also I realized, as I learned to navigate that space, I learned how powerful it was. It was a power within me that I had rejected, denied and avoided, but it was an untapped potential, because, I want to feel joy and peace. Well, I can't, if I don't let myself feel the rage, then I'm not going to let myself feel all the positive ones either. You see, because what you do is what you do. And we just call them good and bad, or right and wrong, or positive and negative, but they're all just feelings. And as I learned to hold my fear, my anger, because I think a lot of it underneath the anger is fear, as I learned to hold that and acknowledge it, I then learned to help my clients do that too. So when they come in with resentments, and I realize what a lot of people do is they, and then they rationalize, but they did their best, and they didn't mean to, and blah blah blah. And what they're not doing is really validating their experience. They want to kind of repress it, minimize it, put it under the carpet, because that's what we've been taught to do, all of us. And so rage, you have to learn to allow it, befriend it, take responsibility for it, acknowledge it, speak it out, not necessarily to the person. I don't believe sometimes that's important to do. Sometimes just to acknowledge it within yourself is really important. So when you start to befriend and you realize you don't have to run from it or anybody else's, I think that's the gift. The gift is that I don't have to be afraid of yours or mine. I've learned to manage it, and part of my job is to teach other people to learn to manage theirs. And I find that when you let people acknowledge the anger, underneath the anger is always pain, there's always hurt. It presents as anger, but underneath it's terror, it's fear, it's pain, it's loss, it's grief, it's rejection, it's neglect, it's abandonment. And so when you start to understand your own rage, and this is for all the people out there that, do struggle, and there's a term called trauma rage. If you've been traumatized, then that can become, you can become very ragey, and you might not express it. The only time you might express it is in the car, all the other drivers, but that's another story. So that's the gift. If you befriend it, you don't have to run from yours or anyone else's. what if your rage isn't something to fix? And I think a lot of people think, oh, I need to fix this. They'll come in and say, can you fix me? I need to fix this. And I always say, you don't need fixing. You're perfect just the way you are. Maybe you need some healing, because your rage, it can be a doorway. It can be a doorway into a new way of being, a new way of existing, a new way of seeing, a new way of being. A fire that burns away the lie that you're supposed to stay small. I love that. I read that somewhere. A fire that burns away the lie that you're supposed to stay small. So I believe my rage was my wisdom, and maybe it's yours too. And if that's the case, then maybe it's time that you listened to your own rage. Anyway, something to think about, something to go away and contemplate. I'll leave it there for now. I'll just say that again. A fire. So what if your rage isn't something to fix? What if it's a doorway? A fire that burns away the lie that you're supposed to stay small. I believe your rage has wisdom. I believe that. And maybe it's time you listened. Anyway, interesting. Be curious. Bye for now.